Like I said already, this is my first time teaching, and of course my first class is on the first recorded murder in the Bible. So we're going to get a little dark this morning, but I think there's a lot of good lessons that we can take away from this story. So appreciate your attention. I know sometimes we look back at stories in Genesis. I do this. I'm guilty of this. Maybe you're not. But we think of the stories in Genesis, oh, those are kid stories, right? Joseph's coat of many colors, the flood, right? The rainbow, the mark of the rainbow, Abraham and Isaac, right? But this story in particular is a pretty dark one, right? Because it is the first recorded murder in the Bible that we have record of. So we may not have, if your Bible class curriculum was like mine as a kid, you may not have gotten an in-depth coverage of the Cain and Abel story as a child. And that's probably appropriate. We don't need to be talking about that in extreme depth as 4 and 5 year olds probably. But I think there's that opens an opportunity for us as adults to maybe look at this story from a different lens. There's a lot of lessons that can be taken away from this story. We're going to go through a lot of that this morning. And I think it's particularly interesting that this story is referenced 3 times in the New Testament. Think how thick the Old Testament is in terms of quantity, pages, all the stories that are recorded. And this story only takes up less than a chapter, half of a chapter essentially. Think of all the other stories we have that are not included in the New Testament, okay? So I want you to think about that. That's very interesting that it's referenced 3 times, at least Cain or Abel or both of them, by a New Testament writer. So don't you think if it's referenced that many times that it's got to be pertinent to our faith as New Testament Christians? That really stuck out to me as I was studying. Again, there's a lot of New Testament parallels that we can make, a lot of lessons we can take from the story. So let's dive into the text, get right into it. So verse 1 and 2, Adam and Eve are banished from the garden, like Josh talked about in chapter 3. God told them to be fruitful and multiply, so they are doing that. They're having children. Notice Eve's words in verse 1. With the help of the Lord. I find those words very interesting. I think she's hearkening back to the promise in chapter 3, verse 15 that Josh mentioned. Keep that in the back of your mind. I think that's something that we can make a point about Eve's faith maybe later on, especially when we get into the Seth portion of the story. Okay, so Eve is clearly living up to God's purpose for her. She's having children. She's like, yeah, if I've got to go through the pain of childbirth, we're going to make this worth it, and we're going to make God's plan to defeat Satan come to fruition. Okay, so Eve bears Cain, which sounds like to get in Hebrew, to obtain, and then, am I too close here, Carl? Am I good? Okay, and Abel, which means breath or vapor. Okay, so maybe some interesting notes there on the names of the kids. Breath or vapor for Abel, meaning maybe this was not going to last long to begin with. So Cain is a worker of the ground. Abel is a keeper of sheep. He's a shepherd. Okay, so Cain's a farmer, Abel's a shepherd. Verse 3. In the course of time, let's just read verse 3. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. Okay, so in the course of time to me denotes coming of age, coming to maturity, a spiritual understanding of the knowledge to please God. Okay, there's clearly a maturity level here that is not like in a child. So Cain brought an offering of fruit from the ground, and Abel brought the firstborn of his flock and its fat portions. Okay, let's go to the next slide here. So let's read these verses. Genesis 4 through 7. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, why are you so angry? And why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Okay? Abel's offering was regarded by God, meaning accepted, pleasing, but God had no regard for Cain's offering. Okay, that's the key point of this story. But I think there's a little bit of misunderstanding on the reason why it was regarded or not regarded. Okay, as a child, at least for me, people made it clear, Abel's sacrifice was an animal, so that was pleasing, right? That's a bigger deal. That's a living thing. That's not the vibe that we get from the Hebrew translation of this passage. Okay, the Hebrew word for offering used here minha, I'm not Will Dilbeck, so I don't know how to pronounce that correctly. It's used several times in Scripture, predominantly Old Testament. It can mean an offering that was an animal sacrifice or a grain or cereal offering. So just a key thing I want you to take away from this class, Abel's sacrifice was not superior because it was an animal, okay? Take that away from this if you take nothing else away from this class. Where we see the difference between the two sacrifices is attitudes and demeanor, okay? And especially with Cain, as we get into the story, you're going to see Cain's reaction to God's reprimand. Clearly, he doesn't have the right attitude, the right heart, okay? So, again, it's not safe to assume that Cain's sacrifice was superior or was inferior because it was not an animal. He was giving to God of what he had, right? He's a farmer. That's the resource that he has available to him is grain and things that grow out of the ground, okay? And Abel likewise offered a sheep, but he gave his first sheep, and I think it's important for us to note maybe his heart was in a better place, right? That may be me assuming too much there, but based on the text, based on the commentaries I've read, this is the vibe that I'm getting from this passage. So notice the first reference to the New Testament of this story, Hebrews 11:4. This is probably the most popular reference that we all know of, the heroes of faith, hall of faith. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts, and through his faith, though he died, he still speaks, okay? So I think that's the key here, the first two words, by faith, okay? We don't have that recorded in the Old Testament, but clearly the Hebrew writer is trying to drive that point home. By faith, Abel offered. It was a faith leading to an action, a worship action, okay? And God accepted that worship action. Faith and reverence were shown by Abel, but Cain, on the other hand, was more concerned with receiving praise and self-righteous purposes than actually offering an acceptable sacrifice to God, right? And especially based on his reaction after verses 6 and 7, we see that, he's angry, he's upset. He clearly doesn't take God's warning to heart. An interesting parallel here, too, I couldn't help but think of Hosea chapter 6, verse 6, if you want to write that one down, right? This is even a passage that Jesus references in the New Testament, Matthew 9:13. For I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings, right? So Jesus himself quotes that passage. So clearly, God doesn't want burnt offerings and animal sacrifices. He wants our heart. He wants our faith. He wants our devotion, okay? So the story could have gone a totally different direction here, okay? The Lord calls to Cain. He speaks to him. He's trying to give him a chance to be right with him. Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen? He says to Cain. If you do well, will you not be accepted? Can you not be acceptable in my sight? And it's an appeal to his reason, also showing concern for Cain. He didn't just leave him wandering, like, you figure it out. You should know what I want. No, God is giving him another chance here. I think that's something we shouldn't take so lightly here. That God specifically speaks to Cain here to give him a warning. And I think he does that for us as well. Think 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9. The Lord is patient, not wanting any of us to perish. So, again, God didn't want the story to go this way. If we take nothing else from this story, take that away. So, ultimately, I see this call from God, verse 6 and 7, as his way of trying to give Cain one last chance, right? It's okay. Maybe not one last chance, because I think we get another chance later, and we're going to talk about that here in a minute. He's giving him a chance to make things right. God doesn't want Cain to be upset, jealous of his brother's sacrifice, or frustrated. If you do not do well, right, here's a warning on the other hand, the end of that verse. If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Okay? These are some dark terms that are referred to for sin. Okay, sin, Satan, the devil, right? Note the words crouching and desire. In the Hebrew, these words were typically used in reference to a wild beast or predator that was stalking its prey. Okay, so that is the mental image we're supposed to take away from this passage. The Hebrew to English translation here is spot on, in my opinion. Satan is portrayed as malicious and sin. He wants Cain to fail. Think of 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion. The words the devil are missing there. Should say the devil after adversary. Apologize for that. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour, right? So this is the image that we get. Previously it was a serpent. Now we have a lion, okay? So Satan's bad news, and God is trying to warn Cain to be on guard from Satan and his devices. I find it interesting, too, that Satan is showing how active he is in Cain's life, just like he was in his parents'. Satan was the one who got Adam and Eve banished from the Garden of Eden, right? Ultimately, it was their decision, and they sinned, right? And that we shouldn't take that away from them. But again, I do find that very interesting. The parallel there. We're just one generation away from Adam and Eve, and here Satan is still as active as he was just during his parents' life. So again, here's where we get into where the story could have gone totally different. Yeah, go ahead, Gary. What you got?
I love the point you're making about the offering, and we sometimes focus too much on the difference between the offerings. We've talked a lot in this class and previous classes about how words matter. And I just think there's a massively huge word there in verse 5. And I may be wrong about this, but it says, but on Cain, and, that's the word I think is massive there, and his offering, he did not look with favor. So we could really take the offering and separate it from Cain. And God was still not pleased with Cain, regardless of the offering.
Yeah.
So, and you made that point. I think it's a great point.
No, that's a great point. Yeah, I failed to mention that. That's great. Yes, sir.
Well, in Romans 10:17 tells us that faith comes by hearing and hearing by the word of God.
Yep.
God had to have told them what
I agree with that.
for able to offer a more perfect sacrifice, as Hebrews 11:4 says, it was by faith, and therefore God directed them. We don't know what he said to them, but it could not have been offered by faith if God had not spoken to them.
I agree with that. I don't think it's fair for us to assume, though we don't have it recorded in the Genesis account. Steve makes a really good point. God didn't leave them out on an island to figure out how to please him, right? There was some direction provided. It's not recorded to us. Knowing our God and the recordings that we do have of him, he would have provided information to them on how to provide the best sacrifice that you could have provided to him. There would have been no room left for wandering there. Good points. Thank you. So here's where the story kind of takes a turn here. Verse 8. We're just going to read this part of the story. Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Okay, so we'll get into the next part here in a moment, but why do you think God asks Cain where Abel is? Anyone have any thoughts about that? God's all-knowing. Why does he need to ask Cain? I have an answer, but I want to hear what you guys think.
Giving him an opportunity to pass on that.
Yeah? Yeah? That's what I wrote. Anybody else have any other thoughts? Yes, sir.
It's very similar to God talking to Adam. Like, why are you worried about this? Why are you afraid? What's going on here? Give him an opportunity.
Isn't it interesting, right? He kills his brother. That part is clear. He's already killed his brother, and he has malicious intent in his heart, and when he does it, there's no accident, right? It's a purposeful incident, okay? And still God comes to him kind of in a peaceful way. I find it very interesting. The Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel, your brother?" He doesn't get angry until after Cain's response. So take note of that, right? It's almost as if Cain could have still been forgiven for this horrendous act. That's what I take away from this story. Notice another thing. I kind of glanced over this, but let us go out into the field is not in my text, but the Septuagint includes that phrase in this passage. Let us go out into the field. Think about it. Cain is a farmer, okay? He's a man of the field. This is his turf, if you will. I find it very interesting that he takes him out to the field as if like, oh, this is where I can do it and no one will know, right? He can get away with it. If this is part of the original text, it definitely makes Cain's intentions to do harm abundantly clear. That's what we should take away here. But again, there's a confrontation. He kills him. We don't have the details on how he did it, but he kills him. And he clearly had the intentions to do so. And my answer is just like yours, sir, is I can't help but wonder if this is one final effort that God made to get Cain to tell the truth and repent of this sin, even though he had already committed it, right? We think, oh, murder, that's a really bad sin, right? Oh, you can't commit murder. But all sin is equal in God's eyes. Yeah, Gary?
We get a little bit more of a glimpse here into Cain. I cringe, honestly, when I read verse 9. I mean, the sarcasm and the demeanor that Cain uses to speak to the Lord is unprecedented.
Yeah.
I mean, God says, where's your brother? Simple question.
Yeah.
Where's your brother Abel? And I'm paraphrasing here. He's like he's throwing up his hands. I don't know. Why are you asking me? You know, am I my brother's keeper? Come on.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just unbelievable that he's able to communicate to the Lord like that.
Yeah.
It shines a light on him.
Agreed. Yeah, and I'm going to touch on that here more in a moment. Yeah, go ahead, Renee.
Seems like from the beginning, Cain always had kind of an attitude about everything when he talks about their offering. He says Cain brought some of the fruit to the ground, but Abel brought the fat of it, and the first fruit, and the firstborn, and all that stuff. It doesn't seem like here's something, and
Yeah.
he thought about what he was doing.
Yeah.
His attitude all the way through.
Almost like Cain just threw something out there. God, will you accept this?
Get off my back.
Yeah, now I'm going to go keep farming, right? But yeah, we have a clear distinction with the wording. Words matter, like Gary said, right? Words matter. All we have recorded in this account is it's very little. So words matter, especially with the creation story, right? We don't have a whole lot to go off of, but this is what our entire faith is based on. So words matter. We can't pick and choose and say, oh, maybe it means this. Maybe. No, we need to take the word for what it says. Clearly, there's a distinction between the offerings. And I like Gary's point, and God had no regard for Cain and his offering, right? So that's a great point. Gary's kind of getting into my next point here, and that takes us to where Cain's answer, right? Cain lies outright. Where is your brother? He lies. That is a sin in itself, right? Besides the murder. So he sins again. I don't know. He clearly knows. He killed him, right? So who knows where his body was, but he knows where he was when he did it. This is a bitter, harsh response to God, okay? God's coming to him peacefully. But Cain has so much disdain for his brother and hatred because his sacrifice was subpar. He wants to take it out on his brother, but clearly his problem is with himself, not with his brother. He needed to look inwardly. And something else, Gary, you might have been getting into this, but I didn't want you to let me steal my point. I do find it interesting that Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? So think about that. Am I my brother's keeper? What's a keeper? It's a keeper of sheep, right? Keeper of animals. I just can't help but wonder if Cain is making a backhanded offense to his brother's profession, right? I found that very interesting. And his regarded sacrifice, right? So that's what I think about my brother. That's what I think about his occupation. That's what I think about his sacrifice that you love so much, God, right? So I think that's interesting. I could be looking way too much into that there, but any other comments, questions before we move on? Yes, sir.
What Gary said, I think it goes back to the original sacrifice, or the lack of it, and added to, because you have a brother, I'm sure that he aggravated you over the years at times.
Never.
But I think that says a lot about Cain there.
Agreed. Great point. And you could probably do, Josh, if he's listening, he's not listening right now, but he will listen to this later. He could probably have a 5-part lesson series on that right there. That the hatred level for his brother was so deep that it's almost like he had premeditated this. I think that's something we should take away. He didn't do this flippantly. This was thought out, planned. There was clearly a problem there. There was a brotherly issue going on. Notice another reference to this story. This is the second one. 1 John chapter 3, verse 11 and 12, John says, "For this is the message that you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother." And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. Okay? So John's driving home the same point that we're all driving. They're taking away the same thing that we're taking away from it. The hatred with evil intentions is what led him to murder Abel. But also another parallel. I'm going to make another parallel to Cain's parents again, because I just find it very interesting. We're one generation away from Adam and Eve, and the difference between their reactions to their sins is so different. Note Cain's response compared to Adam and Eve. When Adam and Eve are caught in their sin, they're afraid. They're ashamed, right? When they're naked, they're hiding from God. We're afraid. We didn't know what to do right now, and I'm not taking away from the fact that they played the blame game. Oh, it was her fault. Oh, it was Satan's fault, right? They did that too, and God reprimanded them for that. But Cain has a completely different response to his being caught in his sin. Cain is hardened. He's ruthless. He's bitter. Okay, so I just find that very interesting. Verses 10 through 12.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I think it's interesting that it says his deeds were evil, not his deed.
Yeah.
His manner of life is something God was displeased with even before he offered a sacrifice.
Yeah.
And this was a way of life with him. And God simply, at that point, and this is probably a strong phrase, had no use for him because of the way he was living. And so he would offer sacrifice for which God had no regard, whether or not it was authorized.
Yeah, agreed. If you didn't hear him, he said his sins, right? So from that last passage that I had up on the slide, I'll just go back to it really quick. His deeds were evil, right? So we talked about the lie, we talked about the murder, but his lifestyle itself could have been very, very evil as well. We don't have that recorded, but I think it's safe for us to assume that based on his reaction to the punishment that he's about to receive. I'm getting ahead of myself there, so Steve's making me jump ahead. But no, really good point. Really good point. So, and the Lord said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." Okay? So this is God's response. This is God's punishment to Cain. Note several things here. Voice of Abel's blood crying out to God. It's crying out for vengeance. God answers the call and punishes Cain. Okay? So this is that punishment. God addresses Cain much more sharply here than he did Adam and Eve. Josh made this point really, really well on Wednesday. Adam is not cursed in chapter 3. The ground is cursed because of Adam. Okay? Cursed is the ground because of you, right? For doing this, for eating of the tree. Cain is directly cursed. You are cursed from the ground. Okay? I don't think we should take that lightly. God telling someone you are cursed. That's a big deal. And notice the curse that he's putting on him. You're cursed from the ground. This is the talent, this is the ability that God has given Cain. He's a man of the ground, right? God is making that very talent that God had given to Cain as a blessing now would be a curse to him. So a constant reminder for the rest of his life. The ground will not yield its strength to you any longer. Okay, so we don't have detail as what did that look like, right? When he would grow his crops, would it not grow properly? Would it not grow at all? We don't really know. Somehow he survived. God makes preparations for him and a plan for him. He is taken care of, as we'll talk about here in a little bit. But we don't know exactly what that would have looked like. It is interesting to think about what that could have looked like. But clearly this is having an impact on Cain's life. I think that's the key thing we need to take away from it. And Cain's reaction to this punishment makes that very clear, that this is a big deal. This is a punishment so much to the point where he says, I can't even handle this. But This is the final reference to this story in the New Testament, Hebrews 12, verse 24, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel, right? So we talked about how Abel's blood was crying out to God for vengeance. Well, the Hebrew writer's saying Jesus' blood is speaking out for a much larger purpose than that, but an interesting parallel between these two stories. Cain's blood is calling out for vengeance. Jesus' blood is calling out for grace and devotion to God. Okay? So, and then the last thing about that passage we just read about, Cain would be a fugitive and a wanderer. Okay, so that gets us into the next part of the story here. Cain will no longer be in God's presence. Now, whether that would be a physical or a spiritual, I'll leave that up to you. I don't have the answer to that, but we are going to talk about that here in a moment. Zach, what you got?
I think it's really quick before we move on.
Yeah.
You know, we do see that Cain is definitely escalating from Adam and Eve, but I think it's really important to also note the similarities between their reaction, because a lot of times I think, at least personally, I think, okay, how did we go from eating a fruit that we weren't supposed to eat to murder? And almost a similar type of sort of punishment for both of those.
Yeah.
Although, you know, we do see the difference between the curses.
Sure.
But I think that the reactions to the sin is really crucial, and how, you know, we think, how can Cain have kind of fallen so far from glory, you know? But we see Adam and Eve, they don't own up to their sin. They don't confess or anything. They hide from God and they make excuses.
Yeah.
And then we see kind of the third option that you can do other than confessing, which is outright lying against
Yeah.
Cain. And so I think it's really important that we see, especially tying in this Hebrew passage, Jesus' whole thing is he's like, look, confess when you sin, own up to it, fess up to it, and that's, you know, why he came and died for us. We still have to do that, that's still our calling. So we see that when we get away from that, when we start hiding, when we start making excuses, when we start lying about it, and I mean, Cain's even blaming God here when we get to verse 14, you know, and so we see that that's really a crucial part of, you know, when we sin, what do we do? The reaction. I think Adam and Cain both teach us really valuable lessons about that.
I agree with that. And Zach, yeah, that's a good point, because I think it's so easy for us, part of the Genesis story as well, is to look and be like, oh man, look how bad they were. Look at all the things they messed up, right? But we got to drive this home for ourselves too. And I think that's a really good point to think about. How does this apply to us, right? We are Cain, right? We make mistakes too, and it's easy for us to look at him and be like, man, what an idiot. Look at all the things he did wrong. But yeah, good point. I saw one more hand. Yes, Steve?
Well, I think that as you started off this morning, it's significant that though this is an account of old, it still speaks to us. The blood of Abel spoke to God. It cried out to God. In Hebrews 12, it says, it was a good testimony. Jesus is better.
Yeah.
But then in Hebrews 11:4, it says, it's still, though he is dead, he still speaks to us today.
Agreed.
And this is perfect. This is something where desire, James is going to talk about desire and conception, sin and death. Paul's going to warn Timothy about those who desire to be rich, fall in a snare and are entrapped and drowned. This is the start of listen to what God is saying. Satan is real. Desire is real. 1 John 2 is going to say the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the lust of the pride of life. He's going to use that against you to turn away from your God. And it starts with the beginning and it goes to the end.
Good point. Good point. I do have to move on. I am running out of time here. Next part of the story here, we get Cain's reaction. Though Cain doesn't show, kind of like what Zach said, though Cain didn't show true repentance, he does acknowledge his crime, but it's his punishment that gets his attention. It's not the sin. He's not repentant. He's upset that he was caught. This is more than I can bear, verse 13 and 14. I think of a child that's been punished, where the penalty for their offense is more severe than they think it should be, right? And that's what gets them to be sorry, not their offense. So again, we're getting a very childlike reaction here out of Cain, and I think it's important for us to look inwardly there and think how we do that in our own lives as well. Compare this to the penitent thief on the cross that was crucified with Jesus, though, in Luke chapter 23. He says we're receiving the due reward for our deeds, right? This was an evil man that had committed a crime, committed a sin of some sort, and he was being crucified. But this man has done nothing wrong, referring to Jesus, okay? So Cain has gone so far to lie about his sin, try to cover it up, get upset with God, but it's his punishment that he's upset about, not the fact that he's killed his brother, not the fact that his brother's blood is calling out for vengeance. Yeah, Gary, what you got?
Super quick, I know we got a lot
Yeah.
to do. We're talking a lot of bad things about Cain here, obviously, but I think, and you kind of referenced this, and it was a good point. There in verse 13, he realizes how important God's presence is. And he says that part of this punishment is I will be hidden from your presence. And he understands that if that happens, the dilemma that he's going to be in and how important that is to have God in your presence.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's interesting to note that he does acknowledge that part because, kind of back to what Steve said, Steve Patton, that we don't know that Cain was living a very, very ungodly lifestyle, but it may be safe to assume based on the information that we have about him. Clearly his sacrifice wasn't accepted, but he does recognize the impact that this is going to have on his life, being outside of God's presence. So definitely some fear of the unknown here, right, when he's going to be banished out into the wilderness. It is interesting to note that in verse 14, behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Okay? So it's interesting that he says that. He's just killed someone. He's afraid someone else is going to kill him. One thing that we need to make a point about is that this clearly implies that Adam and Eve have had more children. Okay? So there are other people out there. That is what most commentators say on this. There is a few people, there are some that debate that maybe there weren't any other children yet and that Adam and Eve would have more children and they would try to kill him later. But that to me doesn't make sense because his fear would have been based on the fact that there were people who knew Abel. Okay, so I think that's what we're supposed to think. There are other children, there is a big family, and people are going to be upset that Cain has killed Abel. Okay, so Cain is afraid that someone's going to do the same thing to him that he did to his brother. But God's response is critical. God shows care for Cain. Not so. If anyone tries to kill you, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who should find him should attack him, right? So he even, after all these sins, he's still made reparations for Cain, right? Kurt, what you got?
Daniel, one quick point. So we're talking about the departure from the Lord. And I think it's really important to go back in verse 5, what the Lord says to Cain after Cain's offering. Why are you angry and why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. We already see the Lord caring for Cain at this point. Even before, so we talked about, can we know Cain's character a little bit? I think we see the Lord reaching out to Cain maybe more so than he needed to Abel, at least as it's expressly said here. The Lord did this for a reason because he knew possibly Cain's thought process and reverence at that time.
Yeah.
And you see the progression of the departure.
Yeah, I agreed. Good point. Good point. And I'm sorry, I know there's a lot of comments, but I do have to move on. Josh will kill me if I don't get through this. But so the mark here, the Hebrew word for mark, is the same word used in chapter 9 when we get to the flood, the after effects of the flood, when God promises that he's not going to flood the earth again. So an interesting note there. It's the same word that God uses to mark Cain. And then in verse 16, this is the climax of this story. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod. Okay, so this is where the punishment is realized. He realizes that he's powerless to fight against God. It's futile. And this mark that we talked about, it could have been a verbal covenant. It could have been something that spread by word of mouth, or it could have been a physical mark. We don't know, right? Again, because the rainbow was a mark in the sky. It's physical, but not really. It is a physical phenomenon, but again, it's up for debate of what it actually was. A lot of people think it was a physical mark of Cain. But again, God makes preparations for Cain, even though he has sinned, even though he's done many things wrong. But Cain's departure from the Lord was both his sentence and his own choice. So Cain settles in the land of Nod. Nod in Hebrew just means wandering, so he's out in the wilderness. We have to assume that he is married because we do get his lineage here. This sets the stage for Cain's descendants, okay? So Cain's descendants that we have recorded, verse 17 through 24, they will serve selfish interests, okay? Worldly, carnal interests, just like their father, rather than righteous or God-seeking purposes. So we're going to cover the difference, the other family that we'll see here in a moment. But this section, I'm not going to read it, but you guys read it on your own time, 17 through 24, that we have these men recorded. Seth's line appears to be the first recorded comparison and fulfillment of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, that we've already talked about so many times. Cain's line is going further and further away. They're sons of Satan at this point, okay? While it's said of Seth's son Enosh that he lived at a time when people began to call on the name of the Lord, okay? So the battle of Satan versus God, worldliness versus worship, secularism versus spirituality has begun. It had already begun, but now it's getting even further and further developed, okay? So there's enmity between Satan's line and Eve's line. That has happened now, okay? Some Canaanite descendants and their contributions to the world that want to take note of. Jabal was the father of tent dwellers and those that have livestock. Jubal, the father of those who play the lyre and the pipe. Tubal-Cain, the forger of instruments made of bronze and iron, right? So like weapons and tools. So maybe the weapons could be another, like, you know, it doesn't say weapons in the passage, but instruments made of bronze and iron. Come on, right? So this is things made with evil intent there, not the instruments necessarily, but clearly Cain's descendants are worried about earthly things, okay? We don't see anything written about, oh, they're spiritual, they're thinking about God, they're worried about serving and pleasing God. No, this line has gone far, right? They're gone, okay? And this line is just going to create more and more people that are not concerned with God, right? But God's making it clear in verse 24 that hope lives on, okay? Hope lives on through Seth's line. Lamech, before I get to that part, Lamech in verse 23 and 24, right? We thought Cain was a bad dude. Lamech is a really bad dude. He's the first recorded to have multiple wives. That wasn't part of God's original plan, right? So he's already breaking that principle. Notice the difference between Cain and Lamech. Cain murdered his brother, and he was hesitant to admit it, right? He lies. Lamech has outright pride in the fact that he's murdered people, and one of them was an adolescent. It was a young lad, was a child, right? So I killed a man for wounding me and a young man for striking me, okay? So Lamech is bragging about his murder. Cain was somewhat regretful, not from a spiritual standpoint, but at least from how he got punished. So this is how far the line of man has deteriorated already. We're not very many generations away from creation, and Cain's descendants are comfortable boasting about murder. Who knows what else is going on, right? We see all the people, this person bore this person, right? Hundreds of years are going by. There's a lot of people being born into the earth. The earth is being populated. Another New Testament reference here, Matthew 18, verse 21, when Lamech says, if Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's revenge is 77-fold. Can't help but wonder if Christ was referencing Lamech when he said, when Peter said, how many times should we forgive our brother? And Christ tells Peter, not 7 times, but 77 times. Okay? So like the complete opposite of Lamech. So again, hope remains. Eve bears Seth. Adam and Eve are holding out hope for the promise in chapter 3, the one that would ultimately defeat. Satan would come through the line of Seth. God, notice Eve's words, God has appointed for me another offspring. And then note verse 26, Seth's son Enosh. Enosh lives at a time when people began to call on the name of the Lord. This is a clear distinction between Cain's descendants and Seth's descendants, okay? Seth's line is the antithesis of Cain's line. Okay, it's hard for you to see this, but this is a nice graphic that Josh made. It's in the material if you didn't grab the material on the back table out in the foyer. take a look at this, it's interesting to note that there's 10 generations between Adam and Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Some debate on the purposes of chapter 5. There's several in my mind. Chapter 5 is a lot of, this person was born, had children, and died, okay? Well, I think there's more to it than that. It shows the certainty of death, certainly. Every one of these people was born and died. It's a reminder of sin's curse. Secondly, it's showing that the earth is getting very populated. This is just one line that we have, right? And they had many other sons and daughters. There's a lot of people being born, okay? The earth is being populated, which is setting us up for the flood story. And then it leads us to the time when God had had enough of man's sinful ways, okay? Secondary purpose of chapter 5 could be that God is giving us some names of specific men that were holy and righteous, showing us that he recognizes when men choose to follow him. So I don't want us to overlook that fact. He didn't just create men, step back, and let things go, okay? He was still involved. He was still interested in men and having a relationship with mankind, okay? One thing that people try to figure out from this story is what's the age of the earth, okay? We're not going to get into that. I do want to cover it for just a brief moment. We have the generations from Adam to Noah, Noah to Abraham, and Abraham to Jesus, okay? But it's not safe for us to assume we know the age of the earth based on these genealogies. We can get pretty close, and we can definitely make an educated guess on it. But one thing is very clear. We cannot believe in this story and the evolution story, and that's my belief on that. Come talk to me afterwards if you disagree, but I think that's one of the main things we want to take away from this class is the creation account does not allow for millions and millions or billions of years. Thousands and tens of thousands may be definitely more realistic based on this story here. So just, if you have any disagreements about that, talk to Josh. One thing to know, in Jesus' lineage in Matthew chapter 1, several kings are omitted, so I would be remiss if I didn't mention that. So some people debate that maybe some generations were omitted to keep this to a nice solid 10 people. I don't have any thoughts on that, but I just thought that was very interesting. Enoch was one of 2 people that we have recorded that did not die. Who's the other? That's a softball question. I'm not hearing it. Elijah, thank you. And then my final slide this morning, by faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death. And he was not found because God had taken him. Now before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. Okay? So Enoch clearly living by faith just like his forefathers were that we have recorded. Okay? So again, I know I had to run through that. I had the short straw of having 2 chapters, so I didn't have a lot of time to take questions and comments. Thank you for your questions and comments. Kevin Floyd has chapter 6 on the introduction to Noah. Thank you.